So I've recently been having a debate with someone. Recently did a response, of course, in the live stream. He sent a video of Sam Seder.
I'm a libertarian and I'd like to debate you.
Fantastic.
And Sam Seder had been debating this so-called libertarian. Have a listen to this argument.
How about this? Everybody can assent to the Constitution and our governance here, and if you don't like it, leave. And you'll tell me, well, there's nowhere for you to go because then you have to assent to somebody else's governing thing. And this is why I say it's a utopian in a fantasy land.
So you're going to come across this argument quite often where they try to say that if you don't like it, then why don't you just leave the country? What they completely ignore is the fact that you as an individual have the rights and liberty to be where you are, to live freely. No individual of society has a right over your life. You can't claim to have a right over someone's life, otherwise you would be known as a slave to them. And the only way that things like the social security, etc. could exist, and things like the income tax, was through government coercion, was through theft and violence. So that's the only way that could exist, because a contribution denotes voluntary action. There is no contribution in that. Your individual rights and liberty had been stripped away from you. You might not be living under the extremes of collectivism like you saw of the Soviet Union, but you're living under enough collectivism that has stripped you of your individual rights and liberty and forced you into a collective group, forced you to pay for others. Whereas your individual rights and liberty, to reject that, to opt out of things like the income tax, etc. Oh, it's not there, is it? Since when did coercion become something moral? Is it moral to use a state to, enforcibly remove an individual of their rights? You didn't get the income tax because people consented to it. Then you've got the argument where the state has gone on the road of its own. It's an authoritarian, self-serving government. How the hell do you think you got to that stage? Through dependency upon the state. You weren't expecting a government to be democratic and serve you, even although the United States of America is not a democracy, after you becoming dependent upon it. Well, if you don't like it, then if you don't like our slavery, then why don't you just leave the country? So why don't you then stop complaining about your big authoritarian self-serving government that takes you to wars that you didn't ask for then? Why don't you stop complaining about that? You're the one that asked for it. You wanted your big government. You got it. The reason why government will always go on the path of its own is because you're dependent upon it.
Then what happens is, what libertarians say to me, they give an example, do you think that world peace is possible? Total peace? And I say, probably not. And they go, but you still aspire for that. But the problem is that when you aspire for more freedom, as you talk about, or I'm not sure whatever the term is you use, and I want to put words in your mouth, but as you pursue that, what happens is that knowing that you can never get there, the problem is that all you do is unshackle the restraints that are on these corporate bodies that began to basically enslave us in a more dramatic fashion. The journey, even if you don't ever get there, the journey there is not as destructive as the journey to this libertarian utopia. Because the journey to this libertarian utopia, unless you get there, it is a completely binary situation. Because this notion where you do not have government constraining any actors in society means that you will necessarily have those who amass power and then amass even more and more power and exploit everyone else.
So again, libertarianism isn't that simplistic. At the end of the day, it's not based on some utopia. Hong Kong was not a utopia. Singapore was not a utopia. They were examples of libertarianism because they were strong free markets. No one's speaking about some utopia and everything's black and white in this world. It's down to a question of scale. Just because you have government ownership of land, government ownership of housing, that doesn't stop it from being a free market. Classical liberals like that of Milton Friedman supported some level of a public sector. That still doesn't stop it from being a free market, because typically what defines a free market is a market that's strongly left be free to regulate itself, especially when it comes to trade and that of, the market where prices are left be to fluctuate freely in the marketplace. The world's most successful economies were all left with extremely low levels of government regulation, meaning a strongly self-regulating free market. Whether you talk about Sweden between 1870 to 1960, it became the fourth richest nation per capita GDP in the world, or you talk about Hong Kong between 1948 to 1997, or whether you want to talk about Singapore for a period right between 1950 onwards up to this very date, and you can see that they are the world's most efficient economies. The Libertarian goes on to mention about period of the 19th century. I acknowledge and I can understand where he's coming from. You could look at periods of the market where it was left be and then contrast that to when government did interfere. The contrasting difference was the free market gave it a showing up. If you listen to his argument very carefully, has Sam Seder, in his actual argument, provided you any historical examples to back his baseless claims up to say, well, in the absence of government regulation, it would lead to all of these monopolies and the giant corporations would run away with it all? Where's his argument? Where is it? I didn't hear it. Where's his argument? That's right, because he doesn't have one. Instead, what he's going on about, and he would probably, like the book that's been read 1 billion times over, is the myth of the robber barons. And that really was a myth. That's one of the biggest myths in American history. It's the myth to say that there was these giant corporations, these giant trusts who came along and then they all shafted the consumer and they drove their prices up to basically run away with it all for themselves. Never in recorded history has a monopoly ever stemmed from predatory pricing. They've got no examples. None. In theory, it might sound reasonable, but in practice, predatory pricing doesn't work. So there is only one way that you can create a monopoly: by restricting productive output, and that never happened. Instead, the consumer price index continuously fell, and of course the giant corporations, the giant trusts, were actually the ones who were benefiting the consumer the most. How were they robber barons again? For what reason were they robber barons? Oh, that's right, because you just don't like big business. And the whole thing over the myth of the antitrust law legislation, pointed out before, folk, don't need to go into it again. The antitrust law legislation, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, did not break up monopolies, because they weren't monopolies to begin with. So the real rationale behind the Sherman Antitrust Act was just there for the McKinley tariff. Even the De Beers Group gained a near-perfect monopoly through nationalisation. You ask people like Sam Seder, where have you got historical examples to show for corporations, because it just happened to be that the corporations and giant trusts came around in the late 19th century, leading to that of a monopoly? That's right. He hasn't got a single example. But the truly fantastic part is the fact that he called libertarianism utopian. So what the hell do you call this economy we're living under today? This wonderful mixed economy, which by the way is corporatist. I thought the government's regulation was supposed to be there to protect us all. Well, you can see here by financial regulations, the myth the banks were unregulated going into 2008. So we can see the private sector's overregulated by the state. Has that prevented monopolies and cartels and oligopolies? So why then do you see an overregulated private sector in the United States American main healthcare market, yet you've got an oligopoly of giant hospitals dominating the market? Why then do you see the American Medical Association monopoly? Who was the one that granted that? Oh, that's right, that was the government. Why then in the American healthcare market, thanks to the third-party payer system the government created, that it created a collusion between private pharmaceutical companies? I thought the government was there to protect you from all of that. He just wants you to believe that government was your saviour. There was some saviour that was, wasn't it? How did government save you? Does it protect you when it shafted the consumer by driving up your education costs? Since the 1970s? Did it protect you when it drove your American healthcare costs through the roof? Did it protect you when it came to Monsanto? Oh, it never did it. But I thought it broke up all these monopolies through its heavy government regulation. Yes, we've beat the libertarians. Have you? Have you really? So if you've beat the libertarians, how come a tiny small fishing village with practically no natural resources gave you a showing up? That was libertarian. It was sitting with extremely low levels of government regulation. Anyway, folk, I hope you've liked the video. I hope you've taken something from it. If you've got any questions you would like to ask, comment in the comment section below, and I'll be sure to, get back to you. Be sure to like the video, share the video, of course, and, of course, thank you for watching. Cheers.